When we think about Mary Queen of Scots, I think it's fair to say that we tend to think of a woman whose reign in Scotland was nothing but a disaster. A queen who couldn't find a decent husband, had no real authority, and ended her life on an executioner's scaffold in England on the orders of her cousin. Well, while aspects of that assessment may be in part true, there has to be more to the story. To discuss this fascinating woman with me, I am pleased to welcome historian Dr Anna Turnham onto the podcast. From her earliest days to her time in France, her return to Scotland, the disasters with Darnley and Bothwell, and of course her abdication. But we also discuss the positives. What did Mary do well? Where did she actually succeed in her queenship? Well, to find out, carry on listening. Oh, and to Amy, who I met last night at the event in London with Tracy Borman, I hope you enjoy the episode. Welcome back to the Tudor Chess Podcast, episode 88, The Reign of Mary Queen of Scots, with Dr Anna Turnham. Welcome to the Tudor Chess Podcast, Dr Anna Turnham. How are you?
I'm very good, thank you. How are you, Adam?
Very well, thanks. You're here today because you have come on board as our historian in residence on a 2026 tour that Sarah Morris and I are running as part of the Simply Tudor tours. We're doing a Mary Queen of Scots tour, from crown to captivity being the theme of the tour. And off the back of that, you're here today to talk about predominantly the reign of Mary Queen of Scots in Scotland and what was involved in that. Before we get into that discussion, though, a few questions just to get to know you a bit better. So can you provide me with a short introduction into your background, so where you grew up, what you now do full-time, and so on?
So I'm from the Chilterns in Buckinghamshire area. I did my undergraduate at the University of East Anglia in history and politics. Then I went on to go and do my master's at the University of York in early modern history. And then I'm just about at the very, very end of my PhD with the University of Kent and the British Library in early modern history. And my PhD research was on the Anglo-Scottish diplomatic relationship between 1558 and 1568, hence why I'm on with you now. And I had a specific focus on the ambassadors and diplomatic agents that were exchanged between Mary and Elizabeth in that period, and the differences and continuities and diplomatic practices that were used by both queens. Currently, I'm part-time historian, finalising the last typos of my PhD. I'm a part-time volunteer for the National Trust at Nuffield Place, which is a 20th century property, but it's very hands-on, and also part-time working for Simply Tudor Tours with Adam and Sarah, ready for the tour next year, as Adam mentioned.
Yes, wonderful. Okay, and what sparked your passion for, I suppose, particularly Scottish history?
So I've always had a passion for early modern monarchs, from Henry VIII to Elizabeth I, really. But I sort of realised there was a gap where we're only learning about the English monarchs, and that led me on to really my passion for passion for female monarchy, to look at Mary Queen of Scots as the only sovereign female monarch in this period. And since then, since my first visit to Edinburgh in, I think it must have been 2016, I haven't got enough of Scottish history, really, and wanted to pursue it further and take a deeper dive into the 16th century history of Mary Queen of Scots. And I've also always been a fan of history, just from visits to National Trust properties, which I'm sure any good historian does on a weekly basis.
Absolutely. It does tend to be one of those things, doesn't it, that when you're young, you get taken to places and it just rubs off on you. It
always
tends to happen. A couple more sort of fanciful questions now, but if you could jump in a time travel machine and you can witness one moment from history, what would it be?
I think I would like to go back to see Elizabeth do her famous speech at Tilbury in 1588 before the Armada. I feel like hearing the emotion in her voice and then the troops carrying over her passion and spirit would just be really awe-inspiring.
Yeah, and it would be good to see, was it exactly as described.
Exactly.
And if you could, based on today's subject, if you could ask Mary Queen of Scots a single question, what would it be?
Oh, single question's difficult. I mean, two words really. Why Bothwell? I think that's all I can really say. Why Bothwell?
Well, I'm sure we will come to that in more detail because, as I said at the start, this is all about the reign of Mary, Queen of Scots, and how she went from being a reigning queen regnant to having to abdicate. So, Mary, Queen of Scots becomes the Queen of Scotland at a remarkably young age, just 6 days old. Am I right? I believe that this is the youngest inheritor of any crown across the history of the British Isles. Is that correct?
Yeah, if across the history of the British Isles, definitely.
Yeah.
She was like you said, youngest Scottish monarch, whereas the youngest English monarch, I think, was months old. So she really does
Henry
put
VI.
that to shame. Yeah,
Yeah, that was Henry VI, who was 9 months old.
yeah, exactly.
So what made her become queen so young?
So clearly her father had to die to her to become queen.
Hmm.
So to give a bit of context, in 1542, her father, James V, was supposed to meet up with Henry VIII in York, and the Scottish king snubbed Henry VIII, didn't meet up with him. And this led to the Anglo-Scottish conflict in the early 1540s, and at the Battle of Solway Moss, Henry humiliatingly defeated James V, who was already ill at this point. Post-battle, 6 days afterwards, after Mary's birth, he died, and Mary became Queen of Scotland.
I see. So, I mean, essentially, there, well, what we've got really is a second king dying at the hands of his southern counterpart, because obviously James IV is also killed in battle fighting against the English.
Yeah, absolutely.
So Mary's great uncle is Henry VIII, and he is adamant that she would go on to he wanted her to marry his son, Prince Edward, because that is drawing the two countries together. It's Henry's intention that he will effectively, by virtue of that marriage, rule Scotland as well. The Scots, however, they've got a long history of alliance, the Auld Alliance as it's known, with France, which led to Mary also being considered a suitable bride for a French prince. Now, this then leads on to something which is known as the rough wooing by Henry VIII. So what actually was involved in this?
Yeah, so I think first it's actually really important to note that the rough wooing is this 19th century gender terms used by historians, and it's been used for years to describe it. And yeah, it's placing all the emphasis on the fact that Henry didn't get his way, so which isn't unusual. But yeah, we need to think of it more as a savage attack on Scotland rather than James V, or rather than the Scottish lords not giving in to Henry's desire. So essentially, the rough wooings, as we're going to keep calling it because we still don't have a term to describe it, refers to a period of military aggression between England and Scotland in the 1540s, and it was over Scotland's independence and the marriage prospect of Mary Queen of Scots to Prince Edward. And in a very complicated situation, the English were deceived by the Scots, who had formally agreed in the Treaty of Greenwich that Mary would marry Prince Edward, but the treaty was never signed, it was never ratified, and by the end of 1543 we actually see that the Scots had taken a different direction, and Henry VIII was furious with this, and this led to the beginning of 7 years of violent warfare from the English side of the border into Scotland. So Henry VIII ordered his lieutenant Edward Seymour to attack and burn Edinburgh to the ground, was his intention. Thankfully, that wasn't fully the case. But yeah, between 1547 and 1550, again, under Edward VI's reign, we see that this pillage on Scotland continued. And it wasn't until French intervention in 1550 that the Scots were able to fight off this vicious English attack. And this began a more peaceful period of Anglo-Scottish relations.
I see. Okay, because the marriage treaty between Scotland and France does eventually take place, and at the age of 5, Mary is sent to France to marry the heir to the throne, Francis, and she would remain there for 13 years. So I'm curious that I'm just understanding in a bit more detail, really. The Obviously the reasoning for it is because they're married, so Mary needs to go and live with her husband. But this is a long period of time which would involve Scotland not having a monarch on its own turf. So at that point, did they just feel that the country could run perfectly fine without Mary's physical presence?
Yeah, I mean, it's actually really interesting. It's quite a continued pattern in Scottish history to have a governor or a regent ruling in place of a young monarch, because this seems to be, again, a pattern in Scottish history to have a young monarch on the throne and no one really to rule. So, for example, 1406, you've got the governor Albany, who takes over for James I of Scotland. You've also got between 1514 and 1524, you've got again the next Duke of Albany, who takes over for the young James V, Mary's father. And then again, after Mary's period, you see between 1567 and 1578, tentatively 78/83, you have 4 regents ruling on behalf of James VI, or the young James VI at that point. So it is a continued pattern. And I'm not saying it worked perfectly every single time there was a regent or governor in Scotland, but it seemed to work to uphold Scottish governance whilst the monarch was too young, and it was a learning experience then. They could almost shape the monarch how they wanted them to be, whether it was in the later days Protestant or Catholic, and how they were brought up, for example, for James VI.
Yeah, because I think that as a continuation on from that, and it's very much a what if, but I suppose the bit that's always struck me is that will have been a bit weird and that could have very well happened is because Francis dies at the age of 16, and following his death, Mary hangs around for, I think, another year or so before returning to Scotland. Had that not happened, had he lived into his 40s, 50s, 60s, then in all probability, she would have stayed in France throughout that whole time. And I mean, where with someone like Margaret Tudor or Mary Tudor, Henry VIII's younger sister, they become queen consorts to Scotland and France respectively. Mary is a queen regnant. So I suppose I'm just curious to understand, well, what would have that looked like? It's a what if, because it didn't happen, but what would it have looked like had Francis lived her full life? And Mary may have never returned to Scotland. Would they have just had a completely absentee monarch, essentially?
So this is again really interesting. There's an example from one of the ones I brought up before in 1406 when James I was sent. He was worried that his father was worried he was going to be captured. He was sent to France for security. However, on the way down to France, he was captured by the English. So then he remained imprisoned in England for 12 years. So in that case, they had the Duke of Albany ruling in Scotland on his behalf. The same year that he was sent down, 1406, his father died. So whilst the young prince was imprisoned in England, within months of that, he was the sort of absentee monarch who had officially been crowned in Scotland. So I think it probably would have been a very similar situation, to put it into perspective. So during Mary's absentee period in France, she had 2 regents ruling on her behalf, the James Hamilton, Earl of Arran, and then her mother, Mary of Guise. And historically, we know that Mary of Guise died in June 1560. So logically, I think the next step would have been another regent would have been put in place. Had there not been the situation that her own husband died, it would have been sorted out within the year. There would have been a power struggle in Scotland. There would have been factions that would have overlapped, and there would have been a need for someone to direct the 3 estates of Scotland on Mary's behalf. And I wouldn't want to put names on who it would have been. The previous regent was now quite elderly. His son was having issues for the last few years. So I couldn't tell you which one it would be, but most likely it would have been another regent would have been appointed, and it worked again for a period of time, or there would have been another power struggle and someone would have taken over from said regent. But it seems to be quite a common practice in Scottish monarchy that regencies were established and to an extent successful.
Yeah, again, I suppose it's just because I'm basing it on how things worked in England, but the notion of, because by the time that Mary is mature and at an age where she can rule in her own right, you would think that they would want they would want her on Scottish soil. So, and then, we know that that's what ends up happening anyway by an accident of Francis dying when he did. But it's just always struck me as a bit of a weird one, I guess, because it's not how things worked in England.
To put it into the English perspective, with Mary I and Philip, I guess he went back to Spain. So perhaps that would have happened at some point for Mary.
Yeah.
Again, speculating, but that could have been the situation for Scotland.
Yes, possibly. And we know that in 1561, Mary, she does return to Scotland roughly a year after her husband dies, and she returns to take up her position as Queen Regnant of Scotland, a role that she has had since she was 6 days old. But she immediately has issues owing to religion, her religion in particular. So what is going on here?
I mean, it's without a doubt, Mary was a Catholic, and she's coming back to a pretty unique situation where she'd been absent and Scotland had its Reformation rebellion whilst she was away between 1559 and 1560. And while she was in France, she would have been brought up in the Catholic French court. She left Scotland in a Catholic situation, so that's all she'd ever known, really. So before she even returned to Scottish soil, her illegitimate half-brother, Lord James, who sort of quite a prominent player throughout her personal reign, he travelled to France to agree conditions of her return with her, specifically regarding religion, and they came to the conclusion that Mary would be allowed to practice Mass, but the new Protestant doctrine that had been established in Scotland under the Reformation Parliament needed to be upheld by her, and she agreed to these terms. So upon coming back, everything was set in place. But I mean, the real issues came from people like John Knox, who we know as the infamous Protestant minister in Scotland, who was shouting about Mary being a woman and being a Catholic, and did the same for Mary I of England.
We loved Elizabeth.
And Elizabeth, yeah, slightly softer Elizabeth with her via media and Protestantism. I think some of the real issues came to light for Mary with her marriage to Darnley, because there was speculation on how staunchly Catholic she was going to make Scotland. And then it was, 1565, during that marriage, that Darnley, also being a Catholic, it really pulled things into question about the state of religion in Scotland. With
that in mind, then, do you think that the rebel group, the Lords of the Congregation, who seized power in 1560, resented Mary returning home to take up her place?
I think that's a really interesting question. I think they took power in June 1560, and it wasn't for 15 months until Mary came back to Scotland. So they'd had time to essentially establish things that they wanted to sort out, like the religion in Scotland. They sort of ticked the boxes that they wanted to before Mary came back. So I don't think resented. I think once Francis died in December 1560, it was almost on the cards that Mary would return, because she was just mulling around, and in Catherine de Medici's eyes, being a pain at the French court. She wanted her gone. So realistically, I think they knew deep down it wasn't going to be their area for the entirety of her personal reign. And I think maybe, again, they might have resented her underneath everything, but on the face of it, she was their monarch and they were loyal to their monarch.
What are some of the wider problems, the factionalism impacting Scotland and thus Mary's reign at this time?
So the clear one being a new Protestant country, or newly Protestant country by doctrine, was the Catholic Protestant factions, which these emerge more prominently at the end of Mary's personal reign, when you get the division, when Mary's abdicated the throne, and
Hmm.
you get the division between King's and Queen's party, which can very loosely be identified as the Protestant faction and the Catholic faction,
Yeah.
Catholic being Mary's. Um, but you see a lot of resentment at the beginning of her reign for the illegitimate half brother, Lord James, that I mentioned. She favours him quite a bit. She gives him titles that were previously bestowed on other Scottish lords. She gives him a very favourable marriage match. He helps suppress a rebellion against the Earl of Huntly in near Aberdeenshire. So she sort of relies on him as right-hand man and someone who supports her side, supports her at the Scottish courts.
Hmm.
But it's really from she gets on very well with William Maitland of Lethington, who's her Secretary of State, and he was part of the rebel group, the Laws of the Congregation. So he's advocating and navigating different political routes in the Scottish court for her to try and keep the peace and keep the calm.
Yeah. How much were the clans still a thing at this point? I mean, the clan culture of Scotland, I think, was much more acute 10th, 11th, 12th, 13th, 14th century. By the time we get to the 16th, is it still, and that dominated a lot of Scottish politics. By this point, is that sort of began to simmer down?
You've got, I don't know enough on the clans. It's more Highland than I am, my
Right.
own research. You get a lot of what we call kinship ties. And that will be, say, you've got the main leaders of a clan, you'll have subsections of families that are loyal to that family. So, say you've got person A, and you've got all the different four subsections of person A, and someone from person B has a problem with someone from person A, everyone is in the corner of person A. They're all on their side. They will fight for them. It's a blood tie as well as a family tie. It could be an area tie as well, depending on where your family's based. So there's lots of different back and forth over that.
Okay. That makes sense because as I said, it feels like at one point that was very dominant in Scottish
Mm.
politics, but by the point we are in the 16th century, it's less impactful and maybe less so the further south you go, based on what you've just said. So some historians have suggested that Mary spent maybe a bit too much time focusing on asserting her claim to the English throne rather than directly ruling Scotland. What is your take on this?
I think that the Mary's claim to the English throne is almost as old as she is, really. When it really stems from Henry VIII's last will and testament, when his third version, where her family or Margaret Tudor's family were snubbed out of the will as potentially being a successor to the English
Yeah.
throne. So this was later argued against by Mary that she should be included, and this has sort of really driven her persistence in her claim for the English throne. Again, another big part of why I think it is a really important part of Mary's lifetime and Mary's story is that when she was in France, before she married Francois, she gifted her title of Queen of Scotland and Queen of England and Queen of Ireland to her father-in-law before her marriage. And it was a sort of thank you
Right.
so much for helping us out decades before. Thank you so much for helping us against the English. And it became a really big part of why she thought she still had a claim to the English and Irish throne. And she was holding on to that throughout her whole lifetime. I wouldn't say it was at the forefront of her mind constantly, but I think she really did believe that she should be Elizabeth's heir and she should be written in as her successor.
Okay, so it's less about really demanding that I suppose it's more about her being acknowledged that if you if you follow the route of primogeniture, which by this point is deeply entrenched in the way that the crown passes from hand to hand, she had the ascendancy over the descendants of Mary, Princess Mary, so the Greys and so on. So I suppose what you're saying is that ultimately she was looking for acknowledgement that actually her claim
Yes.
was the stronger. It may have never happened, but just that being known and acknowledged is
Exactly.
what she was kind of looking for.
Yeah, exactly that. She wanted to know that she could be acknowledged as Elizabeth's successor, just like Elizabeth wanted to be acknowledged that she was the legitimate Queen of England after
Yep.
Anne Boleyn was written out as a legitimate wife of Henry VIII. I think the closest that they came to having this
Yep.
acknowledgement for one another was in 1566, when Elizabeth pretty much said to Mary, right, I will acknowledge you as my successor, but unfortunately, 2 months later, Mary's second husband was murdered, and that really threw a spanner in the works, and all negotiations were sort of thrown out the window after that.
Well, that brings us beautifully on to Mary's second husband, because in 1565 she marries for a second time. This time it is Henry Stuart, Lord Darnley. Now, what people may not be well aware of actually is that, like Mary, Darnley has a claim to the English throne. So what is that claim? How is he linked?
So let's go back to Mary's maternal grandmother. So we have Margaret Tudor, who we've talked about a lot already, and her first marriage was to James V, who we know died. However, her second marriage was to Archibald Douglas, that's the one. And in that second marriage, they had a daughter who was
Is
Margaret Douglas. Margaret Douglas
okay. Yep.
is Darnley's mother, to put it simply. So that's where his claim to the English throne comes from, through his maternal grandmother's side, exactly the same as Mary, making them cousins essentially. And on his father's side, his father was descended from James II, Darnley's father, that is, sorry.
Okay.
So, in fact, Darnley also had a claim to the Scottish throne. This was after multiple Scottish lords above him, but he had very good links into both English and Scottish, the English and Scottish monarchy.
Okay. So we're talking about a guy he's in the line of succession in both lines. He's not Prince William level. He's maybe more Peter Phillips level,
Yeah.
but he has a claim.
Exactly. He was an ideal candidate if we're thinking about, like we've talked about already, Mary and her own link to the English throne and how she can strengthen that.
Yeah. Again, I could be wrong, but wasn't Elizabeth furious when she found out that they'd married?
I think livid would be an absolute understatement. Yeah,
Right.
she was absolutely furious. And funnily enough, she was the catalyst for the marriage.
Yes, because of the whole Robert Dudley like wiggling him in front of Mary thing, right?
Exactly, yeah. And she said, I don't want that Englishman. Essentially, Elizabeth had stipulated you need to marry an Englishman for years. And Mary had gone, oh, maybe, with lots of foreign matches thrown at her. And then Elizabeth approved for Darnley and his father to travel back up to Scotland to reclaim some lands that they wanted to get. And when Darnley landed in Scotland, it took about 3 months for Mary to fall in love with him and decide, actually, you've got an English lineage, you're perfect. And that was it. Elizabeth sent Mary's future husband back up to Scotland for her.
Oh God, that's awkward, isn't it? Is it fair to say though that the Darnley marriage was the first big mistake of Mary's reign?
Yeah, I think nationally it really, really polarized groups in Scotland. It was a mistake because a whole rebellion occurred as a result of Mary's marriage to Darnley, with a group similar to the Lords of the Congregation in formation, called the Chase of Outraged Rebels, who really hated that Mary married Darnley.
Yeah.
I think it is the first big mistake, but in a way it actually strengthened Mary because she solidified her position with a marriage. She wasn't a single woman on the throne anymore. It lined her up to potentially produce heirs, and it strengthened her own potential claim to the English throne for any future heirs that she would produce. So it was ticking lots of boxes on Mary's side. I think from Mary's perspective, she was in the best place she'd been so far, apart from living in luxury at the French court, of course.
But the bigger problem clearly is Darnley's character. That's where it all goes wrong.
Yeah, absolutely. He was quite full of himself. He wanted to be not just king consort. He wanted to be King of Scotland. That was a huge aim of his, and he couldn't really take being second to his wife. It was a massive issue.
So he's eventually murdered, assassinated, he's blown up. But then I believe what didn't actually die via the explosion is then suffocated, I think is maybe what actually happens. Is there any suggestion that Mary was partly involved in this?
Yeah, so I'm going to stay speculative, but depends how much you believe that Mary was conspiring with Bothwell, I think, and was adamant on being a third husband. So we know that Bothwell's men lit the fuse that blew up the building that Darnley was in, and like you said, he was strangled outside, having unsuccessfully attempted to murder him. One piece of evidence that might damn Mary was that she was actually supposed to stay with Darnley the night that the house was blown up. So 9th of February, she said, actually, no, I'm not going to, I'll stay where I am, you go by yourself. And look what happened. And I guess you could also say the day after he died, she didn't go into straight mourning. She went off to Seaton and she left Darnley's father to deal with everything about making accusations, which doesn't look great on her part either.
Well, that's, I suppose, what leads to that's what leads to the accusations against her. The marriage between her and Darnley does obviously produce one big positive. They have a son, James, who's born in 1566. But I'm curious to know whether actually the presence of a royal prince, a future king, a male, did it also in some ways hinder Mary's own position? Because we can appreciate that a big factor in why Elizabeth I was terrified of having children was having her authority then minimised, particularly if she had sons. Was that openly discussed with Mary, or was it just, we've got a son and heir, but Mary is still absolutely secure?
Yeah, I think one historian has argued that, in fact, the birth of Prince James completely strengthened her position. I think with hindsight, had she not had children then, perhaps her personal reign could have been longer. She may have still been with Darnley, or there could have been a divorce down the line, but we'll never know with that. But I think it did in some way strengthen her position because it put her ahead of Elizabeth, who she'd been trying to one up for many, many years. Exactly. And I think it did give any opposition that she had a chance to move past Mary and set their sights on what the future was for this young prince. The young prince was brought up and educated in a Protestant household, and that sort of lays the foundations for him later in life. But I think I might argue it strengthened it, but only on an Anglo-Scottish basis. I think in a national context, it damned Mary without actually ruining the rest of her personal reign. It set things in motion for her downfall.
Yeah, I think that's what it all comes back to, really, is that when we look at the downfall, I think the catalyst is it's her second husband and son, and the combination of the two. Darnley being such an idiot and being so loathed drives his assassination that then damns Mary because she's suspected of being involved. Had Darnley not been the character he was and had fallen into a conventional male consort role more akin to what we later see with Prince Albert and the late Prince Philip,
of course,
then, well, it's entirely probable that Mary's reign would have been very, very different.
Yeah, absolutely. It would have been, maybe she might have taken up the reins a bit more had she, at some point down the line, if he'd have fallen into the consort position, she'd have gained her own agency and sort of stepped into her own, having given birth to a son who secured her position a bit. To throw a second spanner, I know this will come on to it later, but when she married Bothwell, she actually miscarried twins from him.
Yes.
So had those twins been carried to full term, that would have caused another dynastic problem, having had, again, two different sets of children by two different, supposedly, kings of Scotland at that point. So that might have thrown even more pressure on her and actually ruined her position more.
Yeah. Isn't it? I think with Mary, there is this sense that when we look at her story, we look at the story of Elizabeth first, that and this could just be oversimplifying things, but there does seem to be this belief: Elizabeth rules with her head, Mary rules with her heart. And something I picked up on a while ago, and I spoke to Linda Porter about it actually, and I feel like it's something that isn't mentioned very often, is that I actually think that Mary was kind of a chip off the old block of her grandmother, Margaret Tudor. When you look at the decisions they make around choosing husbands that are woefully inappropriate in the end, there's a lot of correlation between their first marriage and then how disastrous their second and third marriages are. Would you agree with that?
Yeah, I think I would. I mean, I actually hadn't really thought about that, so that's a really nice point to draw across.
Yeah.
Yeah, that they make the sensible decision with their first husband. It ticks a lot of boxes.
Yeah.
Or elevates them, or their husband in this case for Margaret Tudor. And then they sort of flick the switch and think, we've done the sensible marriage. Yeah. We need something for our own security, but it doesn't really work in the context of Scotland.
Yeah, and we then have this later situation where their sons are not taken away from them per se, but kind of are. They both feel the need to travel into England, seek sanctuary from Henry VIII and Elizabeth, respectively. There's a lot that connects these two women, grandmother and granddaughter, that we just don't seem to pick up on that a lot.
No, there's some nice parallels there, absolutely, because I think, again, tell me if I'm wrong, I think Margaret only saw James. She only saw James once or twice in a 8 or 10 year period when he was under the regent. And again, Mary didn't see James again after she was imprisoned. So yeah, that's got to be, again, very different experiences, both James V and James VI then being brought up without that motherly figure as well. How they respond to that, and then how that impacted their choice of wife potentially as well.
Yeah, absolutely. It's, as I say, it's just one of those things that it dawned on me a while ago, and for whatever reason is not something I think we pick up on, but there's a lot that parallels there. With Mary's third marriage, it's perhaps her most shocking, for she marries James Bothwell, the man who is almost undoubtedly responsible for killing Darnley. Now, the records are split over whether Bothwell forced Mary to marry him, or if she did so willingly, but sort of through a sheen of pretending she wasn't doing it willingly, but actually was. Where do you stand on this, as best we can tell?
So I think John Guy puts it really nicely. He's described Mary's marriage to Bothwell as the sex scandal of the century. I don't think that's wrong.
She was horny, basically.
Exactly. So that's modern scholarship saying, yeah, this was a scandal, but I think I would agree with the opinion that she did agree to marry him. She was the one that gave him the title Duke of Orkney, which elevated him to be a more suitable candidate for marriage for her. She sent an ambassador to Elizabeth, who had to explain the reasons why Bothwell was a suitable husband for her, saying that he was there for her after Darnley was murdered, and that she said she couldn't continue to rule without the fortification of a man by her side, which I think's problematic and hysterical at the same time, because that's possible.
Would not have gone over well with Elizabeth.
Exactly, that's a big red flag for Elizabeth.
Elizabeth will have sat there going, I've got the measure of you now, Mary.
How many years have I ruled without a man? Yeah, and Mary did absolutely fine between 61 and 65 by herself. And that's considered like a period of peace in Scotland. And then it just turns to chaos as soon as the men start appearing in Mary's life. So I think Mary did consent to marry him. I think whether it was fully willingly or out of fear at some point, that could be contested. But I think all the signs point that she was prepping him for marriage with the title that she gave him.
Well, and she falls pregnant by him, as you mentioned a few minutes ago, and miscarries of twins. How far gone was she?
Oh, that is a great question. I don't think she was past the second trimester. She wasn't that far along, but they know it was twins. There's no mention of the gender of the twins. So as far as I know, it can't be that far along, as much as my medical knowledge precedes me.
Yeah. It's also, I can't think of another example of royal twins.
No, that's very true.
I can't think of any. How does Mary's abdication actually come about? It's basically forced upon her, right?
Yeah, she's imprisoned in Lochleven Castle uh, after she lost a battle to the King's Party group, if you will, as it's called
Hmm.
then. She's imprisoned. She is given the document to sign, and she's tentative at first. I'm not saying she's willing completely from the outset, but one of the Lords of Scotland threatens her, and he says if she would not subscribe, he had condemned her to presently put her in the Tower. So she was threatened to abdicate, and I think she knew there was no getting round it. It was going to happen, whatever the case.
Okay. And the King's party. So by this point, who is actually leading this? I mean, the end goal is obviously to get the infant James on the throne, but who is actually leading this and will be the regent in James's minority?
So the regent to be, the Earl of Murray, or James Stuart, if you will, as well, he was in France whilst he was written to and told, would you like to come back to Scotland and accept the regency? So he arrived back in Scotland on the 11th of August, and 11 days later, he was regent of Scotland.
Didn't hang about.
Did not hang about. He knew what he wanted. And again, I'd said previously, he was Mary's favourite and her illegitimate half brother. So he was an illegitimate child of James V. He had links to royalty. It made him a viable candidate to be regent for James.
So after abdicating, what does Mary do? Does she try and reclaim her throne?
She's stuck in prison, like I said. She's so limited on what she can do. For
Yeah.
context, Lochleven's in the middle of an island, the castle, so it's hard to get to anyway. She was, though, secretly communicating with her network of correspondence in France. She was, through word of mouth or some writings, communicating with the English ambassador who was in Scotland, who was then reporting back to Elizabeth. I mean, the goal was for her
Hmm.
to get support from England and France to send her either troops ideally, I guess, or money to help lead warfare against the lords that had illegally forced her to abdicate her crown. Um, so Elizabeth had sent her ambassador to try and negotiate this with Mary, but he had absolutely no access to her for a 3 or 4 month period whilst he was in Scotland. He could only negotiate with the Regent Murray, and the other Scottish lords. So Mary was really, really isolated and doing everything she could, but there wasn't much she could do until her escape.
And how does her escape take place?
So it's after the Battle of Langside. She uses her charms and wit to escape with the help of her, I guess, captors or whoever's guarding her in Lochleven Castle, to get a fishing boat
Hmm.
across to Scottish land, and then travels across Scotland to the west side of Scotland, and eventually makes it across the Anglo-Scottish border to Carlisle Castle.
So that's the point that she flees into England.
That is when she's in England, yeah, when she's made it to Carlisle Castle. And that's where she'll stay until her
Yes.
execution.
Well,
Not the castle.
I mean, she flees into England because she believes that Elizabeth is going to immediately provide aid to her, right?
Yeah, little did she know. Um, at this point, we see something really interesting happen diplomatically. So usually an ambassador sent just from a monarch to another monarch. That's how they work, and they have discussions. But Elizabeth actually sends an ambassador to Mary and the same ambassador onto the Regent Murray. So she's doing a sort of a two-way communication with both parties. So she's trying to show that she's
Hmm.
not biased. But in actual fact, Elizabeth is furious at the situation because, like I said, Mary's been illegally removed from the throne of Scotland. And she's furious because, A, this could happen to her if she's not careful about it, because they've just seen, well, how easy it is to force a queen to abdicate.
How quickly based on that, how quickly does Mary go from being an ousted queen seeking sanctuary from her cousin into being a prisoner?
Yeah, this is a really interesting question as well that you bring up because once Mary arrives at Carlisle Castle, she thinks she's a queen in exile, essentially. She's just escaped this horrific political imprisonment in her own country. And in fact, you see that the the Englishman, Sir Francis Knowles, who's been sent to keep an eye on her, is actually slowly restricting her freedom whilst in Carlisle Castle. So she's only allowed to walk on the grass in front of Carlisle Castle, and it becomes known as Ladies' Walk later because they didn't want her to go out of
I
sight.
see. Okay.
And then it was 5 months later, she was moved to Bolton Castle, and the restrictions became really severe by that point. She was pretty much inside the whole time. So it was maybe Carlisle Castles where she thinks of herself as a political refugee, but every time the English move her from castle to castle, she becomes more and more like a prisoner.
Okay. And I think another thing about her imprisonment is I think a lot of people don't appreciate just how long she is actually imprisoned for. It's around 20 years, right?
Yeah. And she had a lot of hobbies. She was very, very into tapestry making. There's a beautiful piece of tapestry that she did with her and her ladies' maids. I think it's in the V&A now, where you can tell from what books she was reading, what influences she was getting to put it into the tapestries in terms of animals and stories that she was learning about. So she was still keeping, okay, mentally
Yeah.
active, if not being allowed to be physically active and go on walks outside or go riding because she absolutely loved riding.
Yeah, because she put on a lot of weight, didn't she, by the end of her life? And that's indicative of the fact that she wasn't doing much movement.
She's not the same 18-year-old queen who returns to Scotland. She's definitely the sort of older, restricted, um, more like you'd imagine, yeah, like a queen who's had her two children and then just living
Mhm.
in peace and luxury after producing the heirs, but
Yeah.
imprisonment for Mary.
So my final question to you then is, I suppose when we look at Mary's reign, it is viewed kind of understandably as largely a bit of a disaster, stemming mostly from her second and third marriages, but it can't have all been bad. So to that end, were there any ways in which Mary was a successful and astute queen regnant? Were there some things that she did very well?
I think Mary needs more praise to how she responds in a crisis. Before the Bothwell situation, where she has the Earl of Huntly rise up against her, she quickly suppresses it. The chase about raid rebels rise up against her, she quickly suppresses it. She has opposition to Darnley marriage. Again, she quells public questioning on that. I think that's quite a good or a positive to come out of her reign. Because any division in society was
Hmm.
evident later in her reign, but she kept it at bay during her reign. I also think how she brought Scotland on an international stage should be praised more. I mean, specifically with the baptism of Prince James in 1566, where she puts on this magnificent pageantry with fireworks, with masque, with mock fortress assaults. I think she gets English, French, Duke of Savoy ambassadors in. She really brings Scotland to the forefront of an international stage to mark the celebration of the birth of her son. And again, that's not unusual, but it's just Scotland being so isolated from the continent. She's really trying to draw international attention.
Yeah, so she's
Um,
enhancing Scotland's cultural identity, I suppose.
Absolutely, absolutely. Yeah, and I think there's lots of points where she's made very haphazard decisions. And I think it's unfair to say it was a failure. It wasn't a long personal reign, and her fall from power was problematic, but she had 4 years of peace before her marriage to Darnley. And she came into a strange country with men she hadn't met since her absent time in France for 13 years, into a culture that she wouldn't have been as familiar with as the French court. So, considering all those factors, I think that's a very brave position to come into.
Hmm. How long was her personal rule?
Personal officially was 1542 to 68 officially, but then her personal time in Scotland being 1561 to 68.
I see. Okay, so the time in Scotland is 7 years.
Only just longer than
Got it.
Mary the First, really, and you think both women
Yeah.
achieved a lot in that time.
Well, thank you very much for coming on and having a chat about Mary. This has been really interesting. I was really keen to talk to you because she's a character I know. I mean, as far as Scottish figures from history, she's the one I know the most about, but really at more of a general level. So I was really curious to get to know her a bit better. So for people who maybe want to keep up to date with your work, are you across social media?
Yeah, I've got my Instagram, which is Anna Turnham Historian, if people are interested, or there'll be updates on the Simply Tudors Tour Mary Queen of Scots page as well.
There will. And what are you working on at the moment? I'm assuming it's just getting the PhD done and dusted.
Getting it into the digital repository, and then looking forward to graduation.
When is that expected to be?
Depending on, again, getting it in, that will be July or November, but I'm really hoping a summer graduation.
Well, thank you again for coming on the Tudor Chess podcast. And you and I, if we don't see each other in the flesh between now and May of next year, we will be going up to Scotland together. And thanks again for coming on the pod.
No, thank you very much for having me.
And so that brings us to the end of this week's episode of the Tudor Chess podcast. My thanks to Anna Turnham for coming on to the show, and my thanks to you, the listener, for coming back week on week. Next week, I am very pleased to be welcoming Nathan Amin onto the podcast for the first time. As Mr. Henry VII himself, naturally Nathan is coming on to discuss Henry Tudor, particularly around his book, Son of Prophecy, The Rise of Henry Tudor, where we go right back to the 12th century to Henry's ancestry, right through to the Wars of the Roses. That will drop next Thursday. Thank you again for listening to the Tudor Chess podcast, and speak soon.